director of the Ceranea Center, which is, as you know, the main organizer of the current conference of our meeting. I would like to welcome all participants, and especially those that are present with me on the computer at this moment, to the third edition of our Colloquia Ceranea. Those who are with us for the first time, or either they don't know much about Ceranea Center, I just wanted to remind that that Ceranea Center was established back in 2011 by a group of philologists and Byzantinists working at the University of Łódź. And its activities, I mean the center's activities, focus mainly on the research into the history and culture of the Eastern Mediterranean and related traditions. So the institution was created to commemorate Waldemar Ceran. That's why it is called Ceraneum. And Ceran was a very famous Polish Byzantinist who for decades worked at the University of Łódź. And he took pride of being a member of the community. And Waldemar Ceran immensely contributed to a rise in the interest in the Mediterranean studies in Poland, which he has been able to observe lately. Unfortunately, he passed away some time ago. As far as I remember, 12 years ago. It was back in 2009. Today, we meet to discuss such subjects as you can see, panels, so they are entitled Infidels, Heresies, and Heresiology in the Byzantine World, Bogomil Religious Culture, Written, Oral, and Landscape, Dietetics and Medicine for Body and Soul, Dietary Qualities in Byzantine Medicine, Food and Medicine in Byzantium, as well as a number of other topics that have been categorized as varia, so miscellaneous things. It's really a privilege to welcome our keynote speakers. So first, Mariyana Tsibranska Kostova, who is with us at this moment, and who will shortly lecture on the Slavic South and Byzantium, Prochiron and his Slavic translation in the 13th century traditions, functions, and statehood. And of course, I would like to welcome Stephanie Russo, who will teach us why textual criticism of obscure grammatical text does matter. I mean, matters, basically. I know myself how much, how important it is for the research. I know that many of people that will be present here for the next or the third time. Sometimes it's very funny and I would say heartwarming to see on the list of participants and moderators some people that for ages have been supporting Łódź and activities of the Department of Byzantine Studies and now our Ceranea Center. And there is a very dear person to me, and this is Professor Ginter Prinzing, who will be with us. It's really, I think, very heartwarming, very nice to have Professor after all these years. And hopefully he will be with us now. He's absent from the inauguration. I would also like to welcome all who kindly agreed to present their research to the participants of the present event. I'm positive that it will constitute their permanent contribution to the progress of scholarship, not only in our country, but I would say worldwide. Generally, I'm very, very happy that you have found time to share your knowledge and experience. I want to inform that our plan also covers the publishing of your presentations, of course, if you like, if you agree, in our yearly, which is entitled Studia Ceranea. That is a journal indexed in Web of Science co-collection. Just as closing and approaching the end of my short speech, I just would like to express my gratitude, really deepest gratitude, to those who have been busy organizing the meeting, so our conference, and first of all, to Jan Mikołaj Wolski, who is indispensable, and without him, nothing would have happened. And to Zofia Rzeźnicka, who has greatly contributed, but also to Karolina Krzyszewska and Krzysztof Jagusiak, who accompany us all the time and had their part in organizing the meeting. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you all a personally enjoyable and rewarding time. Of course, spent at the screen of your computers. Thank you all for being interested in what Ceraneum has to offer. And I simply can now declare our conference open. This is the end of my very short address. I just wanted to say that I'm very, very glad that I can see all of you that wanted. I will be an active participant, so we'll be seeing each other over the next 3 days of the conference. So basically, have fun. And now I would like to ask the present director, the most important person, so Ivan Pietrov, Janek Pietrov, to say a couple of words to the participants and to those that are present at this very moment at their computers. Janku?
Thank you, Professor. Dear colleagues, dear friends, I'd like to welcome all of you to the third conference in the series of meetings, Colloquia Ceranea. At the same time, this is our second meeting online. I couldn't, I should say, unfortunately online, but on the other hand, as you know, the pandemic situation makes it possible to arrange scholarly meetings, which in normal time would be very difficult or even not feasible to organize. I don't want to shorten the time devoted to interesting papers and inspiring discussions. So I just will stress that the main idea of Colloquia Ceranea, and in a broader sense of our center, which Professor Kokoszko already mentioned, is clearly visible in the program of this year's conference. This idea is simple: to bring together people from different countries and diverse scholarly areas, to compare our topics and approaches, to find solutions for problems or questions together, and to draw a better picture of the region and periods we are all interested in. I'm delighted that this year's conference unites colleagues from so many countries, universities, academies, libraries, and centers. I'm confident our meeting can become a little, or maybe even a huge, step in the development of our common and individual investigations. So I wish all of us a most pleasant and highly fruitful conference. May it bring a lot of inspiration and new ideas. Although I'm aware that the personal and direct contact, which is so important in this type of scholarly event, is severely limited online, I nevertheless hope we will use this time to the greatest advantage. Dear colleagues, welcome to our university. Welcome to Roach. Professor?
Maybe just a very short introduction. I've already mentioned what expects us in a second. And this is a lecture by Mariyana Tsibranska, Kostova. And I will remind you of the title. The title is The Slavic South and Byzantium, Prochiron and its Slavic translation in the 13th century, tradition, functions, and statehood. And Professor, I would say that the screen and that the computer is yours. You've got like whatever time you need. But basically,
Thank you.
we just envisage that 1 hour will be enough.
Yes, I've got plenty of time, that's for sure.
It's really a pleasure.
Greetings from Bulgaria to everyone. Allow me, first of all, to thank for this kind invitation. It's a great honor for me and a little bit challenge to present the issue I've been working on to such a scholarly audience as this one, the Ceranea Center. The title topic was chosen because I managed to publish a work on the South Slavonic translation of the Prochiron Nomos and the modern Bulgarian, another word translation, which is one of the main trends of Ceranea Center as well, to present the Byzantine and Old Slavonic sources into modern languages. Working from philological perspective of view, I consider my work mostly technical to find the most appropriate word for every single term. I realized once again how the philological work depends on the historical context of appearance of every source. So, philological and historical points of view, prospective approaches, prove the organic nature of what we call now medieval studies. So let's begin. The adoption and the absorption of the medieval Slavic states in the cultural orbit of the Byzantine Commonwealth is reflected in the intensive efforts to translate both canon and secular law texts into Slavonic. Scholarly studies of Slavonic legal documents show a preference for the Byzantine models, particularly associated with the canon law texts. Secular legal works are usually found within the larger compilations of canon law, such as the Nomocanons. The Nomocanon, which combined the laws of the empire and the church canon, became one of the main means for expressing the concept of symphony between secular and spiritual power. It made it possible to adopt Byzantine political philosophy in ready-made form. All types of Nomocanon were of great importance with regard to the adoption of Byzantine political theory in Orthodox Slavic states, the creation of a new Christian identity, and the building of new political concepts. One of the most remarkable legal translation of the Slavic Middle Ages was the translation of the Byzantine Law Book called Prochiron Nomos. I would like to recall some important features of the Byzantine compendium. It is well known that these compendiums were spread to various points of the Byzantine Empire, from the center to the periphery in original Greek, and translated among Copts in the Slavic Orthodox area and in the Arabic-speaking world. The Greek manuscript tradition extends to more than 50 codices. The Greek prototype was a vivid reflection of the imperial power, but its adaptation were provincial. It was just an official reflection of the imperial policy, but had as well the practical function of a guide, a law textbook, and therefore served for training. It covered the needs for a full and comprehensive legal education in Byzantium. It is considered to be a manifestation of the so-called legal classicism or Macedonian Renaissance. Igor Medvedev does not hesitate to call it a large-scale government initiative in the field of law and to note its role in the program of restitution of the ancient laws undertaken by the Byzantine imperial authorities. However, the question of dating remains controversial, disputed mainly by two hypotheses. The traditional one places the Prochiorus Nomus about 817, 879, from the time of the co-rule of the Emperor Basil I the Macedonian, and his sons Constantine and Leo, the future Emperor Leo VI the Wise. The new dating is proposed by Andrei Schmink in 907, the last possible one, shared by a number of scholars. The legal compendium was almost a contemporary of the Isagoge or Epanagoge, also issued on behalf of the founder of the Macedonian dynasty, Basil I, with the participation of Patriarch Photius, and preceded the Basilicas, the most important work of the emperor legislator. One of the reasons for changing the traditional view became the fact that the last three paragraphs of Title IV occurred, as proved Economides, to be a later interpolation. They banned the fourth marriage, as since Leo's fourth marriage to Zoe Carbonopsina in 906 erupted as a political and social scandal, the actual events probably justified the official promulgation of those provisions. The paragraphs in question also stand out with the discursive stylistic marks of the imperial power, a statement in first person, a plural, and the formula our serenity in Slavonic nasha tichost, hichemetera galinotes. In general, the Prochiron has a really unprecedentedly rich legislative matter on engagement, dowry, premartial gifts, marriage, divorce, that is to say, in the field of the family law and the matrimonial issues. More than a quarter of the 40 titles are devoted to this topic. In the preamble, the Prochiron is called Platos ton nomon, universal law, exposition, framework of laws. The Justinian legislation raised to a value standard, it gave a request to deal with terms of Roman law established in the Byzantine jurisprudence. However, as Palic rightly points out, 300 years after Justinian the Great, the terminology needed inevitably to be adapted. So the idea of changing is embedded in the Byzantine prototype itself. The Slavic translation of the Prochiron is distinguished by several significant features of historical and textual character, and some of the questions about its origin and localization still need a thorough and in-depth study. In Slavic environment, the Prochiron shares the main typological feature of a number of fundamental translated Byzantine texts. Namely, it gave rise to an independent translator tradition and had an independent textual history. Similar phenomena could be observed in regards to the Slavic reception of Ekloga and of the farmer's law. At the same time, other compendiums of Byzantine secular law, such as the sea law, the Isagoge, the Basilicas, have never been translated. The most important peculiarities could be summarized as follows. The first one, the Prochiron became known to the Slavic Orthodox area first in the form of excerpts within the frame of the translated nomocanons. For instance, in the Efremovskaya Kornchia, the so-called Efremovskaya Kornchia or Kornchat Efrem, from the beginning of the 12th century, we find only three titles. Title 7 about the forbidden marriages, part of title 24, and the full 28 concerning issues about the property of ecclesiastic and the ordination of bishops and priests. The prevailing scholarly tradition considers this manuscript of Efremovskaya Kornchia to be a Russian copy upon a Bulgarian Preslav translation from the reign of Tsar Simeon in the 910-920. The same titles were repeated in the Ustyu Kornchia from the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century. The titles from the Prochiron then were additional to the basic or high core of this juridical miscellany of various translated work, among them Law for Judging People and the Methodius translation of the Nomocanon in 50 titles. It is not to be supposed the given state was a purposeful choice of the Slavic compilers, but rather due to the Greek protograph used for the translation. The repertorium of Greek law books provided valuable guidance that the mentioned excerpts from the Prochiron have been attached as an appendix to some manuscripts. Since they were inscribed with the table of contents of each respective title, they do not even contain the heading of the legal code and do not distinguish it as an independent text unit. However, the significance of this first form of reception is not to be neglected. It is important as an illustration of a common process between the Byzantine and the Slavic tradition. Like the Ecloga, the Prochiron, in its turn, became the material for new legal compilations. The Byzantine Ecloga ad Prochiron mutata, the Prochiron legum, appear to have been compiled for the Greek-speaking subjects of South Italy and have been adapted to the local requirements. In the Slavic milieu, parts of both the Prochiron and the Ecloga entered in various legal collections from different time. The beginning of this process was set as early as in the 10th century. It may be remarked that the Ephraim Concha, together with the already mentioned titles of the Prochiron, contains the provisions of the title 2, paragraph 2 of the Ecloga. The philological overview unequivocally proves their independent translation. Before leaving this part of the subject, I would like to point an important issue. In the Bulgarian medieval studies, the Prochiron traditionally makes part of the first translated legal books from Tsar Simeon's golden age of literature and culture, which is not quite correct. The opposite, some historians of law argue that even after Tsar Simeon's rule, the penal provisions of the Prochiron have never been applied in the First Bulgarian Kingdom, since in his letter to Tsar Peter, on the occasion of the Bogomils, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Teophilact, said nothing about the death penalty against the dualistic heresy of the Manichaeans and Donatists, and those issues are settled in the 39th title of the Prochiron. The controversial opinions and arguments actually raise the big topic, why? The big topic for discussion. Why was the translation of the Byzantine Ecloga was preferred in the First Bulgarian Kingdom, not the Prochiron? The reasons for this cannot be considered satisfactorily explained. We've got many possible directions of reflection. First, in spite of being an authoritative law book, the Ecloga was discarded and prohibited in Byzantium later because of the Economachia controversy. It is, however, not to be supposed the prohibition of that kind have been applied in other territories, such as in Sicily under Norman rule, the South Italy, as well as in the Slavic-speaking world. Secondly, the controversial view of the promulgation of the Byzantine Prochiron seems, at first glance, to have not a direct relation to the Slavic reception of the Prochiron, but isn't that the root of the problem? From the philological point of view, the Prochiron is considerably more complex and rich in its legal matter, and the shorter and the concise exposition of the Ecloga proved to be easier to apply. According to Benemansky, the influence of the Ecloga was the main reason for the weaker relevance of the Prochiron in the period of the 9th, 10th centuries. We've got a conclusive piece of evidences for this. The first juridical work among Slavs, The Law for Judging People, was a compilation upon the 17th title of the Ecloga. The preamble to the Ecloga has been spread separately in some Slavic legal compilations, while the preamble to the Prochiron has never been translated. The ideological exposition in the preamble to the Ecloga were even a basic definition of the judicial and political program to legitimate the ruler's power. We know this belief and this idea God rewards the emperor with the power, and he needs the universal and eternal law to fulfill his obligations. An additional circumstance is the similarity between the Prochiron and the Ecloga in thematic areas and their text position. Generally speaking, the Prochiron followed the model of the Ecloga. For example, the title 39 for the punishment from the Prochiron is penultimate in the composition and corresponds to the penultimate 17 of the Ecloga, also of penal matters. The last titles of both codices deal with the distribution of the spoils of war. The issues on matrimonial law are placed at the beginning and so on. Therefore, the topic why initially the Prochiron was known only with limited number of titles requires a further study. Here is the oldest Slavonic complete copy of the Prochiron in the Ilovica-Kormchia from 1262. I consider this manuscript a key source. The complete Prochiron appeared with a large gap of about 3 centuries in the South Slavic Kormchia with commentaries, the so-called Nomocanon of San Sava, where it takes its 55th chapter or title. This new compendium is preserved mainly in Serbian and East Slavic copies, the oldest of which is namely this Ilovica-Kormchia. The manuscript originated from the monastery center Mikołaj in Ilovica on the Bay of Kotor, the center of the Zeta diocese. According to the most widespread opinion, it arose around 1912-20 in connection with the establishment of an independent Serbian archbishopry and with the active participation of San Sava, Serbian archbishop, from 1219 onwards. The final approval of the legal compendium took place at the council in Żyta. As in the litera, no other Greek manuscript to date was known to have exactly the same composition of San Sava Nomocanon. Scholars therefore assumed that it was an original Slavonic compilation. A serious reassessment of this view has been raised by a late 13th, early 14th century Greek codex discovered by Ludwig Burgmann in the Vatican Library, Vaticanus Graecus 1167. The content of this Greek manuscript corresponds to articles 149, 53, 54, 57, 58, and 16 of the Slavonic collection, as you can see, not the 55, the Prochiron. No Bulgarian copy of the Nomocanon of San Sava has been preserved. A letter from the Russian despot Yakov Svetoslav to Cyril III, Metropolitan of Kiev, provides indirect evidence, however, that in the mid-13th century, the Patriarchate of Tarnovo had a copy of the Nomocanon of San Sava. The Russian despot wrote to the Metropolitan that he had sent him a Zonara's book. There is also an earlier margin note by the scribe Ioan Dragoslav, who had completed the copying of the Nomocanon on January the 7th, 1262, during the reign of Bulgarian Tsar Constantine Tihasin. Both the letter and the marginal note can be found in some of the Russian copies of the Kormchia. The earliest of these is the so-called Ryazan copy, dated from 1284 in St. Petersburg. As far as I know, a team of Russian scholars has been working on the phototype reproduction of this type of Kormchia, which will be really a great contribution to the Slavic legal studies. The association of the Nomocanon of San Sava with the Patriarchate of Tarnovo and the fact that almost all of its early Serbian copies were connected with Serbian church hierarchs or representatives of the Nemanjić dynasty show that it might have become a true constitution, metaphorically speaking, for medieval Bulgaria and Serbia. As far as the Prochiron was absent from the Greek source, Vaticanus Graecus 1167, the question remains where the secular legal code was borrowed from and why. It is further complicated by the specific cultural context clarified in the paratext preceding the main scribe's note. The main scribe Bogdan provided a kind of conceptual program why the translation was made. A remarkable metaphor can be read in this afterwards. The book Nomocanon has so far been obscured by the clouds of the Hellenic language, and it is the new translation with interpretation in our Slavic language that was called to give clarity, enlightenment to reason, and deliverance from sins. It has ever been a matter of discussion in Slavic studies whether Russians translated legal texts on Mount Athos before the officialization of the South Slavic Kormchia with commentaries. Proponents of this thesis are Trotsky and Moshin. In his research on the Slavic Kormchia book, Žižek also recalls the information that as early as 1142, Russian monks from Xilurgu Monastery on Mount Athos had an interpretive Slavic Nomocanon at hand. So far, the exact location of the translation of the South Slavic Kormchia with interpretations before it was officially announced at the council in Żyta has not been specified. Very tempting but at the same time logical, is the hypothesis of Atonite translation, accompanying the long stay of Saint Sava in the monasteries Panteleimon, Hilandar, and Vatopedi, and his communication with monks of various ethnicity. My preliminary observation definitely confirmed that the translation of the Prochiron was a part of the translation of the whole Colloquia with commentaries. The philological research highlights the role of the Slavic South in the process of transmission. The particularity of is the Slavonic heading of the legal code, attested for the first time in the Elevica copy. In translation, various chapters of the city law in 14 titles, among them the 28 about the ordination of bishops and priests. The idea of an exhausted composition could be found at the end as well. In the subordination of general to private, the Slavic translator introduced the term gran, title, and glava, chapter. This is the internal numbering in every individual title. The term glava has not a Greek equivalent, since in the Greek copies of the Prochiron, paragraphs were preferably marked by numbers. It follows that the Slavic translators found a working solution to achieve a concise and comprehensive structure. The expression city law, thus zakon gradski, does not correspond to the prochirus nomus. The heading is always a type of identification with cognitive value. It can be assumed that the code was designated that way to emphasize its belonging to the official laws of the Byzantine central government associated with the capital, the city-centric characteristic of power. Lots of evidence supports the relationship between the concepts of law, ruler, city. For instance, in the Greek prototype, the place of the creation of the Prochiron is noticed with the expression in tautete our daimoni polei. The Slavic translators added a glossa, sem bogatiam gradia rexche, Caesari gradia. The name Constantinople appears in different cases with graphic variants. Once mentioned, the great church of the kingdom city, Caesarstvo grada. Some language formulas emphasize the official nature of the legal norms. This is the formula, therefore, our serenity with a merciful and pitiful eye, which refers to the emperor himself. The notion of secular or urban civil laws is associated with the concept of citizenship. In general, in the Slavic tradition, the cognate Greek counterparts, politeia, politikos, nomos, correspond to the Slavonic graždanstvo, graždanski, gradski, or vnešni zakon. These processes were in conformity with the basic dichotomy between law and canon, which alongside many differential features, is also expressed in the philosophical opposition. The state unites the citizens, the church believes us. The Slavonic heading marked in cinnabar, as you saw, emphasizes explicitly the 28 title. This mention is a very important sign. Even it was borrowed from a specific Greek copy, it proves, albeit indirectly, that the compilers were aware of the prestige of the previous Slavic translated nomocanons. This title, as I pointed out, was one of the excerpts included in a Preslav nomocanon in 14 titles without commentaries. Since the title regulates the ordination of bishops and priests, its content matches with the church needs at the beginning of the 13th century to administer the law in the church diocese. It is known that the Prochiron contains relatively few cases devoted to church and the clergy. Those are one about the amphitheosis, the 24th about the wills of the clergy, and the mentioned 28 about the ordination of bishops and priests. This title, therefore, corresponds to the task of the Serbian Church, which, having acquired autocephaly, had to deal with the constitution of its dioceses. Prior to the council in Žiča, the three main dioceses, Raška, Prizren, and Ljubljan, were under the authority of the Ohrid archbishopry. With the acquisition of independence, the Serbian jurisdiction extended to Hum and Zeta, which had previously been under Roman rule. New dioceses were formed. It was necessary to eradicate both the strong Hellenization and the heresies. The new interpretive nomocanon became this necessary episcopal book to be possessed in every church department, in every diocese. In the afterwards to the Levica copy, it is noted that that if the bishop and the priest do not know the nomocanon, they do not know themselves. In that period, the Balkans became a crossroad of the relationship between the West and the East of the Christendom. The facts are well known, for instance, that St. Saba brothers, Stephen I Nemanja, received the royal dignity from the West and personally from Pope Honorius II. He married the granddaughter of the Venetian Doge Enrico Dondolo, etc. In these actions, scholars see more diplomatic decisions rather than apostasy from the Orthodox faith. On this occasion, our famous Byzantinist Professor Dujcev says, St. Saba was the one who contributed most to the penetration of the strong influence of Byzantine civilization in medieval Serbia. All his activity bears the traces of the influence of Byzantium. The Orthodox character of the new type of Concha is supported, among other things, by some liturgical phenomena. For example, the neighboring chapter 54 in the Ilovica copy reproduced an archaic Byzantine taxis of Proscomedia with a possible Palestinian Sinai influence. It was published and commented on by Nina Glibetic. Some notes on the hagiographic records of the Prochiron in the Balkans in the south of Slavs. The Prochiron remains closely connected with the history and the dissemination of the South Slavic Concha with commentaries. In its integrality of 40 titles, it was spread in all branches from the so-called first group, which ascending directly to the Ilovica copy. The source base of 11 South Slavic copies accounts to the extensiveness of the manuscript tradition. A new edition of the Concha justified the significance of the manuscript-focused approach, and it is worthy to mention in particular the Sarajevo parchment copy from the middle of the 14th century. It was issued in phototype by the Museum of the Old Serbian Orthodox Church in Sarajevo in 2013, where actually the manuscript is stored. In process of time, the Prochiron continues to spread in the form of excerpts. Two sources of Southern Slavic origin accounts on the thematic grouping of its more popular parts. Those are, first one, the so-called law books, Knjigi Zakonne, where we find titles 11th, 39th about the punishment, and 27th of the Prochiron. This compilation is unknown in copies earlier than the 15th century, and all of them are of Russian origin. The second case is a relatively recent discovery that parts of the Prochiron are also present in the most popular collection of rules and laws for the South Slavs, called Pseudozonaros Nomocanon, Nomocanon of Cotellarius, or even the Penitential Nomocanon of Slavia Orthodoxa. It is important to say that we've got 5 earliest preserved copies from this type of nomocanon kept in Bulgarian and Russian libraries, and they all stem from a common translation archetype that can be identified as Middle Bulgarian through its language. One thing is very important for the Pseudozonaros Nomocanon, it is the extremely large territorial scope. We've got copies from the Balkan area, Serbians, Bulgarians from Moldova, Wallachia, Russia, Ukraine, and even Poland and Slovakia. Here in this miscellany, juridical miscellany, we found a text unit entitled Paki se zapovedi ini od zakonnych knih, regulations from the law books on forbidden marriages and the degrees of kinship. Here are excerpts from the title 7, actually, on forbidden marriages, and some additional penal cases. The translation occurs to have been independent of the complete translation of Prochiron in Concha book. The facts reveal the shift in interest over the penal provisions, while issues of prohibited marriages remain persistent, which is not surprising because the Prochiron is very rich in kinship terminology. The mentioned title 7 has about 35 terms. One of them, for instance, Prashtur, Apgonos, great-grandson, is much commented on. Some marginal glosses in Ilovica copy are dedicated to kinship matters. There are rare cases when the complete Prochiron is incorporated with another type of mixed legal collections. From the South Slavic tradition, one can cite one manuscript from the Hilandar Monastery, a collection of legal and dogmatic polemical works on the second quarter of the 15th century. The manuscript's content is available on the official site of Ohio State Library. It contains a copy of the Prochiron and the Farmer's Law. No other evidence of the combination of the Farmer's Law and the Prochiron in one and the same body has so far been registered in the south of Slavs. This increases the special value of this manuscript from Hilandar Monastery, 466. The Farmer Law obviously is not directly related to any specific composition of the code. It is included on its own, while the Prochiron is entirely reproduced as part of the Sensava Nomocanon. Such a combination reflects the strong interest in the legal heritage and the internal connection between the two sources of secular jurisdiction. The translation of the Prochiron is a new stage of the Slavic legal terminology. And the Byzantine Prochiron was the fruit of the orientation of the Macedonian dynasty towards the values of the classical legal culture from the time of Justinian I the Great and its Corpus Juris Civilis. This aspect refers to the Roman and Byzantine law terminology. From antiquity to the present day, it has been a benchmark for high legal erudition and had to be mastered by every literate lawyer and interpreter. The Slavic translators of the Prochiron faced the difficult task to translate it adequately. In this field, there are interesting relations between the original and the translated term. Omission, preservation of the foreign word in original form, rarely. The words of foreign origin, especially Grecism, do not prevail according to the main ideological program to translate everything in our Slavonic language, as I said. And we've got also translation with appropriate Slavic word. All three processes are exhaustively recorded, but I shall limit myself to just a few examples. In the case with Codiculus, we've got the adapted, phonetically adapted to the Slavonic speech, the same word, codiculo, and translated Slavonic correspondent. Very interesting is the term emphiteusis, nasaždenie, and which makes a derivational forms, a derivational lexical group with nasadivi emphiteutis and nasaditi emphiteuo. The term emphiteusis is interpreted as a long-term lease, right of possession, on use of property or land against the obligation to cultivate them and pay rent. In the Slavic ecloga, the Greek term is consistently translated with nasaždenie. This is one of the few matching terms in the ecloga and the Prochiron, as the differences are much greater than the similarities between those two legal codes. Very interesting is the example fideikommiss. Here we've got an omission. The Roman institute of the inheritance law denoted a form of generosity, the giving of inheritance on the occasion of death, in which a private person benefits and a private succession arises. It is omitted in the Slavonic translation. The Greek original stipulates that the testator can accord gifts, fideikommiss, and freedom to a private person, legata e fideikommiss helioterias, while in the Slavonic translation, not only dari ljudskie, legata, dari, legatum dar, or and osvobождение. Lex Philkidia, Philkidion, is translated with razdělение. This is a very successful semantic solution for the corresponding term of Roman law. It is to note that in the ecloga the given term does not exist. The legal share of the children was called nomi memora and was calculated upon the net estate deducting the debts and other expenses. Peculium is translated with a collocation, osobne imianie. As we know, the peculium is denoted the possessions by a non-legally independent person under guardianship, given to him to manage them without being their true owner, actually. And the adjective osoban, private, personal, own, replaces idios out of collocation as well. Among other interesting examples, one should mention the total lack of the term tabellarius and notarius. Notaries were frequently referred to in Byzantine law books. They were responsible for the production of private legal acts, and the terms for those positions have been known since antiquity and were especially established in Justinian law. As typical Roman terms, their main function did not evolve much in Byzantium. The professionals in the preparing law documentation were denoted by grammatic and pisece. Both have a larger meaning because every person mastering the literacy could be called pisece or grammatic. We've got also Hertularius, the letter, attested in both Efremovskaya Kornchia and in the Ekloga. And to finish, I would like to give the examples with pristavnik, equivalent to epitropos. This word occurs in general in two principal meanings: against epitropos, guardian of a minor who manages his property, but in the collocation, Cesarski pristavnik, epitu procuratorus to Basileus, from the Latin procurator, manager of the imperial revenues in the province. And we've got also representative or custodian equal to hranitel, and even pristavnik refers to kedemon, guardian, protector, patron. Synonymous substitution can be interpreted as problematic fields in the real existence of some officials and their functions. I would like to attract your attention to the revival of the Roman Byzantine secular law patrimony in the Balkan by giving some facts. The most important of the post-Byzantine law miscellanies is the Syntagma of Matthew Blastores, around 30-35, and the 14-15 Slavonic translation. Well acquainted with what sources carried primary authority, Blastores referred to the Prochiron as his alphabetical syntagma. However, this form of existence of the Prochiron remains completely unexplored area and deserves a special attention to make some comparisons between how the Prochiron exists in the alphabetical syntagma, in the Kornchia books, and etc. In later periods, especially in Wallachia and Moldova, that is to say, where there was a strong ruler's institution, the Prochiron enjoyed a vivid popularity. The so-called Romanian textbook, commissioned by the Moldavian Prince Vasilie Lupu and printed in 1646, consisted of the Romanian translation of the farmer's law together with those of the city laws and the basilicas royal laws. And to finish, I would like to draw some conclusions and to point out some problems that need further development. The first one for me is that the issue of the authorship of the Slavonic translation of the Prochiron remains open. Was it a mixed team of Slavic scribes, Russian monks, Serbians, and Bulgarians? What was the profile of the Slavic nomikos the legal translations were entrusted to? What is sure that it cannot be claimed that there was a preliminary Russian translation of the Prochiron. On the contrary, the Russian 13th century recensions develop on the basis of the South Slavic photograph. The Slavic translation of the Prochiron affirmed the Orthodox faith and its pure, the statehood in the era of the Latin Empire of Constantinople. The return to the foundation of the Roman Byzantine legal heritage served political, social, and legal goals which have always been decisive for the fate of the Byzantine legal code in different historical periods and in different areas of its reception. With its values oriented towards the Roman law, and its projections in the Byzantine jurisprudence, the Prochiron is a true encyclopedia of the achievements of the ancient and the medieval legal thought and a manifestation of the concept of Roman identity of the Byzantine Empire. And to finish, I think that a wide field opens up for Byzantinists and Slavics for further study. One more thing, the period from the beginning of the 13th century until the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans is defined by scholars as a period of decline in all areas of Byzantine legal literature. We can say that with the translation of the Prochiron, on the contrary, we've got a flourishing period of the Slavic legal translations. I finish here, and thank you very much for your attention. This is the cover of my book with the translation of the Prochiron in modern Bulgarian language. Thank you very much again. What happens? Do you hear me?
Professor Maciej Kotoszko?
Yes, I finished, but
Yes, we hear you.
I don't hear you at all. Now it's better.
It's time for questions.
I'm extremely sorry, Professor. It was my fault. This is basically software I'm not familiar with. That's why I had problems just to switch on, switch back. So that's why. But now I think I can operate. So, Professor, first of all, thank you for your lecture, and my privilege is to ask questions whether any of the participants would have something like a comment or a question addressed to Professor Mariyana, Tsibranska, Kostova.
I realize that it's quite specific as a subject, so I don't expect a private discussion.
In Poland are many people that are interested in the history of law, and especially in the transmission of the first Roman and then Greek law, say, into vernacular languages. And what you presented is of an interest of people I personally know. They are not, as I can see with us, but there are other that might be interested in.
Somebody tries to say something, but I don't hear anything, actually.
I will use the privilege. I don't see any hands raised.
Okay.
Or one wrote in the chat that he has questions, so I will use my camera switched on and my microphone. When I use for my studies, Nomocanos, I always ask myself the question, how these books were used, who produced them, and for who. I'm not sure.
There are some troubles in the connection. Yeah. Could you repeat, please?
Is very poor. We can hardly see you. We can hardly hear you. We can only receive like bits and pieces of what you're talking. So could you just rephrase? Now the connection seems to be more, better simply.
Is it better now? I will start the discussion using privilege. I have my camera and microphone switched on. When I use for my studies Nomocanon, I always ask myself question, how these books were used, who produced them, and for whom. I'm not sure if it's just meta, that my studies are too superficial, but I haven't found satisfactory answer in academic literature. You have mentioned that one regulation that bishop and priest should know the law book. As I remember from my studies on Nomokanon Archivski, that is different than
Exactly.
Nomokanon. There was stated that it's book just for bishops, not for ordinary priests, as far as I remember. But these books commonly are used to reconstruct disciplinary organization of the church. It raises, of course, problems, different regulations, which may be found in one Nomokanon for the same problem or different Nomokanon. During your work with Prochiron, have you upon any clues which help us to address this problem? Especially, are there any linguistic facts which will help us to address this problem? It's especially interesting because Prochiron is secular law. And you have mentioned that there are some translations where there were used a synonymous institution, what may indicate that probably some institution.
Yes, that's my hypothesis, yeah.
But were there more such examples? And if there were more such examples, does it give us any does it lead to any general conclusion?
Nothing allows me to make a general conclusion. I'm just supposing that this could be so, because I gave the example with pristavnik, which means 5 different terms, translates 5 different Roman terms from the Roman law, which is problematic for me, actually. As concerns the ordination of bishops and priests, I didn't say anything about, because my main concern and what I succeeded in identifying was the title 7 from the Prochiron as the basically as the base for this text unit Paki Zapovedi regulations in some of the copies of the earliest copies of Pseudozonaras Nomokanos. I wanted to point that the Prochiron was used with relevance to forbidden marriages and to kinship terminology. As concerns the ordination of bishops and priests, insofar I haven't found anything which comes from the Prochiron in the Pseudozonaras Nomokanon. It is mainly about the terminology of the kinship, of course changed, not the same as in the Corntia, but this text unit, Paki Zapovedi, is, as I'm positive about that, is based on the title 7 of the Prochiron. Perhaps used from one of the South Italian provincial combination of Echloga and Prochiron. We still don't know what is the Greek source of this Pseudozonaras Nomokanon. We should start from identifying the Greek source and later to make conclusions.
Thank you very much.
So thank you for the question and thank you for the answer. Are there any more questions or comments?
If you have a question, please raise your hand or write on the chat.
Yeah.
We'll let you switch your camera and microphone.
And perhaps people need some kind of break. I don't know.
So if not, so Professor, thank you for the lecture. And I think we should make a break just to switch to our rooms and visit our panel discussions and panel presentations. And just wanted to remind all participants that 1 o'clock, so 13, There starts a panel called Bogomil Religious Culture, which is organized by Andrew Roach and which will be moderated by David Zbíral. And at the same time, in the other, I think that in the Plenary Room, we'll have a panel Dietetics and Medicine for Body and Soul, Dietary Qualities in Byzantine Medicine, which is organized by Isabel Green Stadelman and which will be moderated by Professor Ginter Princi. Professor, it's so nice to have you after so many years. Yeah, I'm really extremely glad. So I think it would be wise for us just to switch off for a second and then join the proper chamber. Am I right? I'm addressing Jan Wolski.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so we have like 7 minutes off, and just please be punctual at 1 o'clock in your chambers, in your rooms, for listening to the presentations and for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Susan.
1 sharp. So I would just like to welcome all of you at this panel, which is concerned with Bogomilism and its religious culture. And without saying a word on the panel, I will give over to Andrew Roach, the organizer, who will introduce the panel.
Hi, well, welcome everybody. This is really an assemblage of people with fairly long-standing interest in Balkan heresy, and I think we've got a very nicely balanced panel in the sense that there is me, sort of straight historian, looking at the context. There is Bojana taking a more literary approach, and then we've got Maja Angelovska-Panova, who is well known for her work on women, participation of women in heresy, and we've also got the voice from the organizers in the shape of Jan's paper. So I think that really we're bringing a lot of perspectives to a question which is clearly going to be fairly central over the next 2 or 3 days. Much of the academic discussion on Catharism over the last 10 years has centered on whether it really is what we believed it was in the first instance, a dualist heresy, or whether we are in fact a victim of medieval rhetoric and of othering opponents within the same religious community. So I won't waffle on any longer, and instead, if we move to the first paper, and I'm sorry, Maya, I haven't got your paper, the title of your paper in front of me, but Maja Angelovska-Panova is the distinguished professor from the University of Skopje.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for organizing this session. Also, I would like to thank to the organizers for the opportunity to be a part of this conference. And in this occasion, I'm going to speak about the phenomena of Bogomilism in context of hagiographic literary works. The term hagiography literary means writing about saints, which refers to the life and deeds of a holy man and women. It is classified as a specific genre of Byzantine literature, but it also includes all kinds of literary works that promote the veneration of saints, including acts of martyrs, lives, hymnography, as well as some historical events. Taking into consideration the complexity of the genre, it is a common impression that the credibility of the historical narrative is debatable, and it can oscillate from subjective to objective position. So one must be very careful, especially when it comes to reconstruct the historical events, in our case, questions which related to the issue of Bogomilism. It is a common impression that the data from the hagiographical works concerning the Bogomil heresy are incidental, incomplete, and very often tendentious, in a negative sense. In such circumstances, the comparison with other historical and relevant sources is more than necessary in order to achieve an authentic presentation of the event. In the long life of Saint Clement, composed by Teophilact, the Archbishop of Ohrid, written in the period between 1084 and 1108, it is said, "Watch from now on your heritage, because now you have much more and greater power than before when he was alive. Cast out the evil heresy, which after your true death in Christ was kindled as a contagious disease among your flock." Despite the fact that some of the historians reject this information from Teophilact as an anachronism, it is still evident that it corresponds to the chronological framework. Namely, it is already known that Clement of Ohrid died in 1916 and Bogomilism appeared later in the middle of 10th century. There is no doubt that the cult of Saint Clement was particularly widespread in the Ohrid region during the following centuries, which represents a relevant argument for Theophilact to invoke his authority in defense of orthodoxy. In fact, the data from the life of Clement concerning the existence of the evil heresy largely coincide with those in the correspondence of Teophilact, which occurred the period from the end of 11th and the beginning of 12th century, when the Bogomilism in Macedonia was intensified. The movement continued to exist with the same intensity during the reign of the Byzantine Empire Manuel I Comnenus, 1180. The first information about the dispersion of Bogomilism in the Meglan region in this period can be found in the life of Saint Hilarion of Meglana, namely, since he was appointed for Bishop of Meglan between 1133 and 1142, Saint Hilarion discovered that a considerable part of them were Manichaeans, Armenians, and Bogomils who were reviling him and plotting against him. They were trying in the dark to shoot the righteous of heart, despoiling and leading astray the Orthodox flock like beasts of prey. Having seen that they were daily increasing in number, he suffered great sorrow and prayed earnestly from his heart to Almighty God to stop their inveterate tongues. As a spiritual activist who reacted from the position of official Christianity, Saint Hilarion sought to convince heretics of the inaccuracy of their teaching, insisting on the importance of dogmas from the point of view of the official religion. After realizing that the number of adherents of Bogomilism was growing, he often preached to his people, teaching and strengthening them in the Orthodox faith. It is interesting that Hilarion managed to convert many Paulicians and monophysites to orthodoxy, but it is evident that only the Bogomils remain separate from that process. In fact, Hilarion did not succeed in suspending the Bogomil heresy because by this period it had already been established within the Byzantine Empire with a concrete and standardized way of acting. Interesting testimonies about Bogomilism are also contained in the life of Saint Sava, written by his student and follower Domitian in 1242-1243, according to the Viennese manuscript, or in 1253-1254, according to the Leningrad manuscript. According to chapter 18, titled as Teaching of Saint Sava for the True Faith, the saint referred to the Orthodox interpretation of the Holy Trinity as well as to many other aspects characteristic for the Orthodox Christianity. In fact, the data related to the Bogomilism are presented very supply and mainly come from context. Domitian, with an extraordinary literary maneuver, presents the efforts of Saint Sava for defending the true Christian values as opposed to those of heretics. In fact, he does not mention concrete heretics, but insists on the orthodox interpretation of certain dogmatic determination, which have a completely different meaning in heretical communities. It is assumed that Domitian used the sermon of Presbyter Cosma for this part of the life, especially since the order of the dogmatic determination largely coincides in both parts. The life of Saint Sava by Theodosius represents a successful literary composition of an already narrated story. In fact, as he himself points out, rewrote the life of Saint Sava according to Domitian instructions, probably during the period between 1290 and 1292. Actually, the literary innovation consists in the fact that Theodosius presents the same story in a different way, using a new sentence structure and compositional processing of the text. Referring to the question of heresies, Theodosius identified their followers as vicious, dark in light, ignorant of the truth, and he prayed a lot to those who were in the heresies that he commanded and taught them to return to the Orthodox Apostolic Church, promising imposts and gifts. But for those who refused to return to orthodoxy, punishments such as persecution and anathema were envisaged. The life of Theodosius of Turnovo, written by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Callistus, is also an important source for the period of the 14th century and, in that respect, for the existence of Massilian and Bogomil tendencies on Mount Athos. In fact, Theodosius of Turnovo and the biographer Callistus were trained together in the hesychastic practices of Gregory of Sinai on Mount Athos, which means that they knew each other. According to the data from the life, there was a nun in Thessaloniki called Irene. Residing in Thessalonica, she passed herself off as if living in purity, but furtively and secretly she was a perpetrator of all kinds of impurity and vileness. When the monks discovered what kind of woman she was, many of them began to meet together where she was living. She, the totally unclean one, had mastered the entire Massilian heresy, which she taught in secret to all those who visited her for the sake of impiety. Because the heresy became widespread, many monks were affected by the error, and when they went in separate groups to the holy mountain of Athos, they offended the monasteries there with poverty and begging. Also Lazarus and a certain Cyril with the nickname Bosota, who spread Massilian Bogomil tendencies on Mount Athos, were mentioned in the life of Theodosius. Accusations of decadence were a common practice for displaying the heretics, within the frame of hagiographic literature. So Lazarus, who, accused of insanity while Cyril manifested his evil heresy by blaspheming the holy icons, trampling on the sanctuary and the cross of life, teaching men and women to renounce their legal marriage. In context of dispersion of heresy, the priest Stephen, a follower of Cyril Bosota, is also mentioned. After the council in Trnovo held in 1360, led by Theodosius, Lazarus, who perceived his mistake, took to penance until the end of his days. The dirty Bosota and his like-minded disciple Stephen froze like stones. The pious Tsar, having seen their useless pseudo-wisdom, ordered their faces branded with hot irons and drove them out from his domain for good. The council having completed its work and its bright deed accomplished, everyone returned to their place. The data in the life of Theodosi of Trnovo largely correspond to those contained in the history of the Byzantine historian Nicephorus Gregoras, according to whom heretics did not preach. They opposed to holy writings, rejected the divine mission of Christ, and disrespected icons. The teaching was discovered in 1344, and the protagonists, monks Joseph, Gregory, Moses, Isaac, David, and Iov, were accused of following the teaching of the Massilians and Bogomils. Nicephorus Gregoras gives an account of their trial and adds that some of them were given penances, but others were expelled from Athos, while some escaped to Thessalonica, Beroea, and Constantinople. Speaking about the spiritual progressing of Gregory Palamas, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Philotis, in the life dedicated to him, emphasized that on the way to Mount Athos in the winter of 1316-1317, the young Gregory Palama stayed in a monastery on Mount Papikon, on the borders of Thrace and Macedonia, where he disputed with some local heretics whom his biographer calls Massilians, but who were Bogomils, because they claimed that the Our Father was the only legitimate prayer and refused to venerate the Holy Cross, but distinctively Bogomil traits. As a conclusion, we can point out that in the period of the 14th century, the Bogomils acted very subtly, namely hiding themselves behind the ideas of Hezekism practiced in the monasteries of Mount Athos. They actually affirmed Bogomilism. Despite the obvious differences between the two teachings, they showed some similarities, especially regarding the issue of contemplation, which was resulted with a hypostatic union with God. The complex nature of the lives in terms of whether they can be treated as a relevant historical source is evident, but also it is an indisputable fact that they contain data concerning the question of heresies, in our particular case on Bogomilism. Based on the above-mentioned lives, actually we found out about the status and dispersion of Bogomilism in certain periods and certain regions in Macedonia and on the Balkans. In that respect, the action of the Bogomils in Ohrid and Meglen region is mentioned. They also testified about the dogmatic determination based on the life of Saint Sava, as well as for the existence of Massilian and Bogomil tendencies on Mount Athos. Certainly, according to the already established methodology for writing a biography or in attempting words' lives, the authors first of all have in mind the asceticism of the saint, but in the context they also mention specific events such as the existence of heresy, in our concrete case of Bogomilism. It is interesting to note that the saints in debates with heretics have always been gentle and patient, and in the beginning usually used the tactic of persuasion. Dialogue as a tool for converting to orthodoxy was a priority in the saint's tactics, who was certainly the personification of virtue, justice, and wisdom. Most of the excerpted biographical data correspond to the historical sources, which speaks in favor of their authenticity and relevance. Although we cannot ignore the general impression that in both examples the authors, independently if they are historians or churchmen, who are mainly of Orthodox provenance, cannot refrain in terms of classifying heresy as evil, weak, and so on. Thank you for the attention. In this short version, actually, I paid attention only on several prominent examples, but in the extended version, there will be include the all existing lives. Thank you for the attention one more time.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your talk. Thanks a lot. Perhaps some of you have seen that that we have discussed just before the session with the organizer and Roach that we would put the questions at the end. So please hold on. There will be the opportunity to have questions and answers, and remember your questions until the end, because we're now, without further ado, actually jumping directly to the second paper in this session by Dr. Bojana Radovanović, and I already see that the presentation works absolutely greatly. So let me welcome now Bojana, who is now a postdoc at the Radboud University Nijmegen, but she has defended her thesis previously in Vienna, and it dealt with the question of notions of heresy and heresiology in comparison between the Byzantine and the Carolingian world. So Bojana, without further ado, the floor is yours. We're looking forward to listening to your paper.
Thank you very much, David, for your nice presentation. I hope you hear me well. Is it loud enough? Okay, so I'm very happy to be here today and to see you all, but I'm at the same time sad that it's not in person, and I hope this is the last time that this Colloquia Ceranea is happening in this format. And so my presentation will, as you will see later, will very smoothly align to Maja's presentation, and I will be speaking on the role of the oral transmission on the example of the Bogomils, and the function of the oral transmission, but also the biblical exegesis. Basically, the scope of this topic can be structured in a threefold scheme. First, we have the oral transmission in itself and its importance, and then its social setting or its social mirroring, and then the symbolism or exegetical way to observe the oral transmission. So, as we know from the Bogomil Christology, that we know that Logos, the Son, descended from above and crept through the right ear of the Virgin and put on a body that appears to be physical only, but is in reality immaterial and divine. Basically, Obolensky says that this mythological account on Christ's birth, which was attested by Eusebius Sigabenus and found in Interrogatio Johannis, Wolensky says that this refers to the hearing of the word of God and of the preaching. On the other hand, we know this may also be that the Bogomils liked this idea due to their docetic point of view, denying that Christ took human flesh, and that they interpreted it in a literal sense, as was put forward by Bernard Hamilton. But also Yuri Stoyanov points to the importance of the oral transmission of the canonical as well as extra-canonical textual elements in their diffusion among the Slavonic communities, and particularly in the vernacular. So now what is important to say is the importance of the oral transmission and its apostolicity. As we know, already from the ancient times and from the very dawn of this religious Jewish religion as well as Christian religion later, we know that in Talmud, for example, Jehovah's original sayings were orally transmitted. Then in the New Testament, we have reference to in Paul's epistle to the Romans. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. And so later in the Gospel of John, it's also mentioned that there are so many other things which Jesus did, which, if should be written, the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. It's also important to say that, for example, in the early medieval Bulgaria, it was a common practice, even before the Christianization, to debate on the issues pertaining to faith. So now, if we come to examine the social mirroring of the ways of oral transmission among the Bogomils. First, we know that the Bogomils used to be very active. We know that according from the sources. They used to go from village to village, but also from town to town, often visiting people at their houses. They also went to the Orthodox monasteries. And here, the importance of the vernaculars is to be underlined. Namely, we know that this applies also to the Western Europe as well as to Byzantium. In the 11th and 12th century, and even a bit earlier, we know that the majority of the population was incapable of understanding the sermons in Latin and Greek. And then plus there were the crises in church in the West as well as in Byzantium. And we know that a gap appeared ready to take in heterodox preachers who simply stood in and filled it. So because the official preachers were not able to reproduce the good news in vernacular. And even more, forbidden apocryphal books were in possession of the Bogomil preachers who propagated their legends. So this is namely one avenue of research which will be examined furtherly, which I will examine in detail later this year. This is the rise of wandering preachers in Western Europe and its comparison to Bogomils in the East. We know that, for example, the hermits of northern Italy were very much carriers of the Eremitic revival in the 10th century, and this Eremitic revival is linked basically to the spread of itinerant preachers. We know that when a man decided to become a wandering preacher, whether Orthodox or dissenting, he often started by going into forest and living for some time as a hermit. Curiously, in an account of Eusebius Zagabenus, we have the story that Basil, the Bogomil, met an old man living in a deserted place who gave him a book which escaped the hands of John the Chrysostom. So, as I said, wandering preachers and itinerant wandering preachers, but then another important, it's important to say that there were, if we could see it in this light, we could speak maybe, there is a not frequently attested feature among the Bogomils, which may be observed as one of the facets, one of the ways of the Bogomils' itinerancy, but also the ways of drawing attention to themselves in spreading their message. Basically, there are only a few cases, as far as I found, of the Eurodivis Bogomils. So there is one account in Eusebius of Periblepton where he accuses certain Peter to be a heretic, and he feigned humility and falsity. And also his madness and heresy were concealed. We cannot be sure that it refers to Eurodivos. But then there are the two Bogomils, which Maja mentioned from the life of Saint Theodosius of Turnovo, were basically referred to as Eurodivi, as the fools of God, and Kirill and Lazarus. Kirill preached his Bogomil teachings, whereas Lazarus started acting as a holy fool. But it's important to say that they were before, also what Maja said, they were Athonite monks who fled Mount Athos, where we know that the Hezekism came to spread, and then they came to Turnovo, propagating the Bogomil doctrine. Right. Interestingly, in this life of Theodosius of Turnovo, the danger of the Bogomil heresy was mentioned in the same context and in the same passage with the danger of opponents of Hesychast controversy, Varlam, Gregory, Akindinos, and Afanasiev, who were also named heretics. So it's interesting. So then, as I said, so the third way of how they propagated their doctrines, oral transmission, occurred most likely in the monasteries, as we said, but this is also a topic to be developed. We know that they used guile and that they mingled among monks in Orthodox monasteries. We know that they were not different from them in their appearance, according to the accounts of Cosmas the priest and Anna Komnena. So this is to be developed more thoroughly later. And now we come to the third point. It's the symbolism of the oral conception. Oral conception basically is the term implying, as I said at the beginning, which is present in the Christian tradition, where the Virgin Mary was at times viewed as having given birth to Christ through her right ear, as we have this myth was also attested in Bogomil teachings. So we have this tradition in Syrian hymns, which are Orthodox, fall to Orthodox teachings. So Ephraim the Syrian in the 4th century and Jakub of Seru, also from the 5th century. Then this concept basically may be related to the I Parthenos, the concept of perpetual virginity of Mary, which came to be heavily debated upon the Council of Ephesus in 431, when Mary was officially proclaimed Theotokos, Mother of God, and then the Council of Constantinople in 553, which attributed the title I Parthenos to her, and then the Council of Lateran in 649, where the threefold character of Mary's virginity was proclaimed before, during, and after the birth of Christ. So this all can be related, but I'm not saying it is, to this oral conception, but it was banned at the Council of Trent in the 16th century. This doctrine of perpetual virginity of Mary can also be brought into connection with some Gnostic views of Mary as an angel, which was also attested in Cathar elaborations. What is interesting also to say is that the account of Mary's birth in close relation to hearing, obeying, is found in the apocryphal texts. For example, Gospel of Bartholomew, where the archangel tells to Mary, "I will send my word unto thee, and then shalt he conceive my son." Then also in other Gnostic writings, such as Marcion and Ascension of Isaiah, which is related to Proto-Evangelion of James, basically. And the notion of aureum conceptio was also present in philosophy of the 5th century Neoplatonic philosopher Proclus. Furthermore, later in the 12th century, we have monk Jacobos describes that the Virgin conceived through a bodiless voice, which caused the Son of God to be clothed in the corporeal nature. And then what is also important to say that speaking of iconography, this symbol of auricular or oral conception is attested very rarely in Europe. We have it in Würzburg in Germany, in Marienkapelle, the Annunciation scene. The tube stretches from Archangel Gabriel to Mary's ear. But in other traditions as well, if we leave aside the Christian tradition, in other traditions as well, the ear relates to the act of hearing, and we have it in Egyptian mythology that the right ear accepts the air of life and the left ear the air of death. And the Mongol savior was born to the right ear of Mahana. And but there is more to this story. If we advance this symbolism further, one step further, and upgrade it, so to say, we can see that ear is related to a shell, because we have it also, for example, in Slavonic languages. I know for Serbian, we have a školjka, the name of a shell, is used for the exterior ear, namely as a symbol of birth and rebirth, and also linked to the symbol of spiral, symbol of fertility. But if we then go one step also beyond it, the shell, we know the shell is the bearer of the pearl, symbolizing Christ in Origen's text, but also in Syrian Orthodox tradition. In the Bogomil teachings, pearls represent the more secret and more valuable doctrines of their error, according to their interpretation of Matthew 7:6 and to Eusebius Gabenus. This passage is important because it shows that it implies that there were less and more secretive teachings of theirs. And now, if we go to the visual arts, the symbol of the shell, the symbol of the birth from shell, is well attested in the Renaissance art. But there are also other significantly more ancient analogous iconographic representations. For example, on the Zigma mosaics on the locality of Gaziantep in the western part of the southeastern Anatolia in Turkey, we have the birth of Aphrodite represented in a seashell. But this dates 2nd century AD. So this is and then the womb. So then we come to the womb of the Virgin Mary as presented as a shell. This, for example, there are mosaics of the 6th century Basilica Euphrasiana in Poreč, which was decorated and painted by Byzantine artists. But we also have it, for example, in a miniature of the representation of the adoration of the Magi in the 10th century Armenian Ekmiadzin Gospels. But curiously, an iconographic representation of Christ in a shell is also to be found on the Balkans. So, the Bogomil monastery was erected probably by Konstantin Dragaš, Serbian nobleman and lord, nephew of Tsar Dušan, at the end of the 14th century. It is dedicated to John the Theologian. The monastery was situated on the hilly slopes of the border region between nowadays Serbia and Bulgaria, near Dimitrovgrad and the village of Sukovo, in the canyon of the Yerma River, and may have been erected either by the local constructors or the imported ones. Interestingly, this name, the name of the monastery, reveals possible traits of a former prior pagan pre-Christian site or activity in this region. We know that at the time of its erection, it was situated in the realm of the Second Bulgarian Empire. Bogomil monastery was painted in 1499, so in the last year of the 15th century. The iconographic themes represent the Pentecost, Apostles, Christ's Passion, details from life of the Virgin, Christian saints and Serbian saints, John Chrysostom, Gregory of Nyssa, Apostle Paul, celestial liturgy, Ezekiel's vision, and sources of vision. Curiously, among the frescoes, figures is one in which child Christ is depicted in a shell, or more precisely, in a virgin Pretitera scene in the apse. So, I couldn't enlarge this, unfortunately, this beautiful photo, but we can see here it's in Pretitera scene, so that means the womb, which is presented here in the Virgin. Here is a Christ child represented in a shell. But I will show you other scenes as well. Right. So the iconography of the Bogomil monastery falls to the artistic school of the second half of the 15th century, consisted of itinerant painters, of a team of artists who decorated the churches from between the Meteori monasteries and Kostur, Ohrid, Prilep, Skopje, and Niš. These frescoes, what is important to say, for example, the scene, the sources of wisdom scene, has its antecedent in the 14th century Lesnovo Church in Eastern Macedonia, which show signs of adoption of some Hezekist elements, what is curious. And this theme was, for example, common theme at this time. But what is more important to say? Now, if we return to the Bogomils, we know from a very short account of Eusebius de Periblepton, we know that some painters were also attested among the Bogomils. The Bogomils were said to visit the monasteries and to pretend to be monks, but also to pretend to paint the icons, or to paint the icons, as Eusebius says. But there is another more curious account sometime later. So from Thomas the Archidiaconus, there is this story dating from the early 13th century on the two brothers, Matthäus and Aristodus, who originally came from Apulia, came to Bosnia to pursue their career as icon painters. They were excellent icon painters, and but also they spread their heretical doctrine, which Thomas Archidiakon basically says it was Catharism or Manichaeism. And but this is just to show that there were also Bogomils among the painters as well. And another interesting thing to say is that in the 12th century, abjuration formula alludes to the Bogomils as Pogomils, P instead of B, which is clear. The etymology between pogan in Slavonic languages is the same as etymology of the pagan, Latin pagan. But additionally, what is the bottom line of all this is just to say, at the very least, the name of the monastery points to the preceding presence of non-Christians, most likely in this region. They could have well been the Bogomils. That was the bottom line of all this presentation, at the very least. And just to conclude, I would like to say that, yes, I think that maybe we could speak of the graded sequences of oral transmission. First, the Bogomils maybe transmitted some doctrines which were easier to accept based on general Christian narratives, and then in the second stage, the Bogomils transmitted more secretive doctrines. So, as they say, as Eusebius de Periblepton says on the Bogomils, in the beginning they teach the newly converted simply, exhorting them to believe in the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. But later they beguile them little by little, and they bring them to destruction slowly. As time goes by, they make them obedient, and then they give them the deadly potion, blaspheming openly and initiating them into the teachings of the evil. And it may well be that during this first, if I'm right, this first stage of the oral transmission of the Bogomil doctrines, they could have mingled among monks, or if we are to search them among monks, or why not maybe expand our search and try to think of them as maybe painters or artists, or I think they could have well also mingled among other strata of society or of professions. Yes, so important to say, the Bogomils should also be seen as important mediators in the chain of the transmission of knowledge, extra-canonical textual threads, but also of literacy, and especially of the vernacular tradition and heritage. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bojana. Thank you. And as said previously, that we will have a discussion at the end. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Andrew Roach, the organizer of the panel, who is senior lecturer in history at the University of Glasgow. To the panel, he's perhaps most known for his monograph on the Devil's World. Yes, so he's going to present you the paper entitled "Bogomils in Context: Religious Culture in the 10th Century Bulgarian Empire." So, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. I will say at this point that the panel is really rewarding our hours of careful coordination that we didn't do. It couldn't have gone better, to be honest. We're all sort of going on nicely at different angles. Over the last 20 years, there has been a growing skepticism over the transmission of dualist beliefs from the Bulgarian Empire of Tsars Simeon and Peter to the Cathars of southern France and Italy. While this debate is inconclusive, and I still believe that the balance of probability is that dualist beliefs were transmitted from east to west, it has rather drawn attention from the Balkan context of the spread of the Bogomils in the 10th century. Since the academic historians from an earlier generation on the Bogomils, such as Angelov and Primov, there's been a lot of study of conversion and the difference between conversion and Christianization. Much of this has come from Northern Europe. One thinks of the Christianization and the rise of Christian monarchy project run by Nora Berendt. As the title suggests, it was mainly interested in the interplay of conversion and royal power. A little earlier, Henry Mayer Harting compared the conversion of the Bulgarians and Anglo-Saxons. So one way of approaching the Bogomils and their origins might be to look at some aspects of how Simeon and Peter's empire was in fact Christianized, and then look at Cosmas the priest's account of the church and its difficulties in the light of that. While we know a lot about the politics of conversion and increasingly the archaeology of conversion, we know little about religious culture which surrounded the process of Christianization. Although Boris, the Tsar of Bulgaria, was baptized in 865, there was probably little attempt to Christianize the wider population until the disciples of Cyril and Methodius were expelled from Moravia in 885 and put to work by Boris. And the project had really only just begun when there was the pagan reaction under Vladimir, Boris's eldest son, which forced the old Tsar to come out of his monastic retirement, depose Vladimir, and elevate his younger son, Simeon, to the status of Tsar in 893. The lives of Cyril and Methodius, and this is where I dovetail quite nicely with Maja, are very helpful in that they give clear accounts of their Christianizing techniques in Moravia. And since this was carried on by their disciples to the southeast, then I think we can sort of draw some conclusions about what is going on in the Bulgarian Empire. Famous was their translation of the liturgy, the Bible, and the laws, but it's also striking how both trained up local young men to become the clergy of the new church. Neither life says how many men Rastislav of Moravia originally offered to Constantine, and of course he did already have Frankish clergy, but a better insight might be taken from the lives when they mention Kotzel, the ruler of Pannonia, who they contacted, who offered about 50 students, according to the life of Constantine, and about 20, according to the life of Methodius. The most important of the active disciples who made the move from Moravia was Clement, and the early 12th century life, written, as we've heard, by Teophilact of Ohrid, is very helpful, as it provides some indication as to how and why he was a successful missionary. The first impression is that he is operating on a far larger scale. One should not put too much weight on medieval measures of numbers, but observe them more as a sense of proportion, and you do get the considerable difference. Theophilact writes, in each diocese he had people chosen from the rest, and not a small number, for they were up to 3,500 men. With them he spent most of his time, and revealed for them the deeper passages of the scriptures. And these were the backbone of his clergy. He ordained subdeacons, deacons, and priests from among them. In every district, Theophilact said, he used 300 disciples, not to count the helpers, so obviously a wider community. And Theophilact, Clement, endowed them with sermons for feast days, accounts of miracles and psalms. This in itself was an admission that the initial training had been fairly basic, as it resulted in Bulgarian priests, according to Theophilact's account, having been only taught to read, and he therefore concludes that they were as stupid as beasts. There is the sense that great things had been done in terms of speed and scale, but not necessarily in terms of depth of knowledge. And I did sort of just bring to mind the almost contemporary experience of in the West. You've got the Cluniak Monasticism, where Cluny lends its name to this incredible the spread of a monastic, obviously not an order, but a monastic brand, if you like, and also offers to guarantee it that its orthodoxy by inspecting everybody that wishes to become a Cluniac house. But in practice, they cannot do this. And so you get, in Western writers, the allegations, well, corruption and eccentricities going on. And I think that you can see sort of parallels with the East. Around 50 years after Clement's death, you then get Cosmas's account of Bogomil, and he sounds quite similar in his techniques. He preaches all over Bulgaria, and he has a very similarly empowering message like Clement, he and his followers draw their audience in, seeing their great and special humility, as Cosmas records, and thinking that the heretics, are orthodox and capable of instruction in matters of salvation. People draw close to them and ask them questions pertaining to the salvation of the soul, taking advantage of ignorance as they do. The dualism which Cosmas records seems to be oral in transmission. That just after he records the difference between those who term the devil a fallen angel or those who call him the steward of iniquity, he gives the intellectual genesis of the debate by saying, in their desire to surpass one another in ingenuity, each of the heretics invents his own imagined name for his own father and teacher, so that you're getting this sort of wider community, and again the ideas being sort of passed down. So there clearly has been the propagation of teaching here in a more or less Clementian manner, with textual communities of preachers having formed around teachers. The domestic setting as a springboard for religious observance was also important to both Clement and the followers of Bogomil, according to Theophilact and Cosmas. The Hagiography of Clement mentions that when the disciples had first been established by Boris, the nobility brought them to their homes. They strove diligently before the saints, each one convincing them to visit his house. And indeed, this sort of visiting becomes so prevalent that Boris has to regulate the process. And I wonder if there's even a sort of political aspect to this. Cosmas recorded that people seem to have welcomed Bogomils, followers of Bogomil, into their houses. Some of the heretics shunned work, and they instead go from house to house and eat the goods of others. Cosmas spends quite a lot of time discussing one matter which the authors of the lives of Constantine, Methodius and Clement do not, and that is prayer. And I think this is a significant difference. I mean, I'm not saying that prayer is not mentioned, but Cosmas's heretics spend much time praying and they talk about it. Cosmas reports the heretics as claiming, "We pray to God more than you." Indeed, their program of prayer, which is recorded, is quite impressive. 4 times during the day and 4 times during the night, which they do in their rooms or in their houses. Moreover, one of the instructional aspects of Cosmas's text is that he includes prayers for the Orthodox, particularly to be said in the presence of icons, which of course the heretics hate. Then when we see the icon of Mary, the Holy Mother of God, again, from the depths of our heart, we cry out to her, "Most Holy Mother of God, do not forget us, who are your people, for it is in you that we have our protection and sinners their support." And he then gives a sort of portmanteau prayer to be said in front of an icon. "Saint of God," here we name the saint, "you who suffered for the Lord, you who have influence with your master, pray for me that I may be saved by your prayers." In other words, of all the other aspects of life that Cosmas is talking about in the early medieval Bulgarian Empire, he's actually giving prayers to be actually said, so that clearly perhaps that is the one aspect that's lacking. The suspicion here is that there is a tension between the laity's prayers and the fact that serious praying only goes on in monasteries. There's abundant evidence that withdrawal from the world was seen as the most certain way of saving your soul. All of the early Tsars, even probably pagan Vladimir, ended their lives in monasteries. Tsar Simeon's new capital at Preslav featured at least 8 of them. There were also nunneries. In the life of St. Mary the Younger, we come across a Bulgarian nun possessed by an evil spirit who is cured at the saint's tomb in Bizet. Next to heresy, monastic discipline is Cosmas's main concern. One of the most engaging sections of the work is his account of monks going to Rome or Jerusalem, returning eventually, and indeed going back to their wives, sometimes living in the houses of others again, regaling listeners with their tales of faraway places. I think it's particularly envious in lockdown. Cosmas is keen to disabuse his readers of the virtues of the desert, that if monks carrying their pre-existing desires, then many were lost to perdition in the deserts and in the mountains. They had things of this world on their minds, but many who lived with wives in cities were saved. Once again, he is alarmed by the initiative being shown in the spiritual community, with monks coming up with their own reasons for modifying a rule or living a reclusive life, and sending letters and instructions to others everywhere, trying to build a reputation. And I think this is the point of tension in newly Christianized Bulgaria. It was difficult to be saved if you were in the world. As Cosmas's imaginary interlocutor say, it's not possible to save oneself in the world. One has to, by necessity, worry about wife and children. Besides, you have the responsibilities to serve the masters of this earth, of undergoing the hassle of the society and the violence of its leaders. And I think you can see here that one's resolution of that tension would be a dualist solution, that everything in the world is evil apart from that tiny bit of God within you, so that you can fulfill your duties to the evil world and yet still have some pretensions to holiness. I think within a more orthodox explanation, that the perception was that only life as a monk could lead to salvation. And there is the strong implication here that life in a monastery, in Cosmas's writing, was only available to the rich. Cosmas's prospective monk also declares, "But I'm rich. I wish to suffer in a monastery and save my soul while living in poverty." And more famously, in fact notoriously, Cosmas reports that the heretics teach their followers not to obey their masters, scorn the rich, hate the Tsars. They ridicule their superiors. They reproach the boyars. They believe God looks in horror on those who labor for the Tsar and advise every serf not to work for his monastery, for his master. Interestingly, only a few paragraphs later, Cosmas addresses monks directly. If you spend your time working for the earthly magnates, as you say, or if misery, the commands of men, prevents you from praying to God, do not blame the former, but fulfill your tasks even more diligently. And even then goes on to suggest night prayer. The appeal of the Bogomils, besides whatever heterodox doctrine, may well have been that they offered a cheaper form of monasticism in terms of lifestyle and prayer, that you could live at home. And they tackled the problems of a society that had actually become very engaged with the Christian message. Besides moral failings and inequality of wealth, can we make an assessment of how effectively the spiritual aspirations of Simeon and Peter's empire were catered for? Religion had become, if it had not been earlier, a state-sponsored project. As most of those who have studied state projects will agree, one priority can often get mixed up with another. Florin Curta has perceptively noted the correlation of religious establishments in Boris and Simeon's empire with border defences in his northern cave monastery at Basaraba. This may have been a direct attempt to importune heaven for protection against raiders, or perhaps just an attempt to provide spiritual sustenance for the soldiers who were stationed there. Curta has also posited a bishopric based on the excavations of a church on the Danube at Silistra, which looks like a smaller copy of the basilica at Pliska. The idea of border defences makes sense of Theophilact observation that Clement had noticed that the prince girded the lands subject to him with 7 cathedral churches, as if lighting up a candelabra with 7 candles, i.e. Bulgaria, the Bulgarian empire, is surrounded by border bishoprics, if you like. The exact location of these bishoprics is disputed, but the southwest was certainly one of the priority areas that Boris, Simeon, and later Peter has to protect. One explanation of Clement's bishopric of Dragovista or Velitsa is that it ran from the extreme southwest of Simeon's territories, southwest of Thessalonica, up into the northern mountains. There was also plenty of spiritual provision at Pliska and later Preslav. So the capitals are also covered. The center of the country, that sort of large area which aren't included in this, is much hazier. It's famously the territory of John of Rila and his disciples, but again, they're offering a form of monasticism rather different, the very eremitical. As for the Bogomils, they seem to have sprung up in Macedonia, and indeed there is the village of Bogomil, and Obolensky suggests that it's this sort of area where they first become known, and Hamilton's evidence points to the region as being a home of a Paulician presence and the point of origin of the dualist church of Draguntia. One last sort of point is, I think that Cosmas functions as a political critique as well as a spiritual one. That when he talks obviously about not the heretics not working for the Tsars, he identifies a political threat, but also in his insistence that the heretics don't like relics. Well, since Simeon and Peter have been filling their sort of capital with relics, that is a commentary. Equally, that the Cosmas' heretics don't like John Chrysostom, and again that Simeon had commissioned quite a lot of translation of John Chrysostom. So, I mean, in conclusion, I think that what you've got here is a critique of spiritual life, if you like, from Cosmas. And I think that heretics are an important part of that, but he is really calling for the modernization, if you like, of Christianization. That it seems to me that he is providing a critique of the shortcomings of what has gone on under the disciples of Cyril and Methodius. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And we're getting to the last paper in this session before the discussion, which will be given by Jan Mikołaj Wolski. I will switch off my camera because I was told that only three images can be on the image. So of course, Jan Mikołaj is from the very University of Łódź, organizing this conference. So no need to present him extensively, but he worked on he has been working on monastic culture, on Bulgaria, and today he will be speaking about the letter of Patriarch Teophilact, Lekapenos, and Heresies of Bulgaria. So Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And David, I have a presentation. No, not that one. Just a moment. That's it. I'm going to talk to you today about a letter sent by Patriarch Teophilact of Constantinople to the Bulgarian ruler Peter. Teophilact advises Peter on how the Bulgarian church should respond to the appearance of heretics in his state. In the letter, the introduction is a long-winded praise of the ruler who cares about the purity of faith, after which the Patriarch moves on to specific recommendations. Heretics should be divided into 3 groups according to their degree of involvement in the movement. He goes on to discuss the reception of those who wish to convert separately for all 3 groups, and the punishment of the persistent dissenters. The readmission of heretics into the church was linked to renunciation of the faith under the form of anathemas, which enumerated the erroneous beliefs characteristic of deviation. 14 anathemas are given in our letter. The first 9 contain the cursed truths of the faith, the next 5 condemn the leaders of the heresy, from Scythian, the Egyptian Buddha Manes, to other figures associated with the Paulician movement. The heretical creed is called Manichaeism mixed with Paulianism. It resonates with anathemas that condemned a dualistic worldview. The Patriarch does not mention other names of heresy. That is enough for now. We'll return to the dogmatic issues later. When and under what circumstances was the letter sent? Here there is no concrete information. We can limit the date of the letter to the 23 years of Teophilact's ministry. It is known that the letter was the 4th sent between the Patriarch and the monarch on this matter, and the correspondence was initiated by Peter, intrigued by the newly emerging movement. In his second letter, Peter set out the doctrine of the heretics and, apparently, asked how they should be dealt with. We know of no other circumstances that would allow us to interpret the contents of the letter. I have listed on a timeline various events that are sometimes mentioned when analyzing the confessional situation in Bulgaria in the mid to late 10th century, and sometimes shown as the context for the emergence of Bogomilism. But none of them have a close enough connection to the letter to help us interpret its content. Note the stretch in the time. From a 1,000-year perspective, we tend to ignore the 10, 20, or 50-year gaps, but this does not render them irrelevant. The letter was written up to 90 years after the Christianization, a few years less after the supposed Paulician mission sent from Teophilact to Bulgaria, from 10 to around 30 or even more years before the speech of Cosmas was written. The temporal proximity of the letter and Cosmas' sermon and the vague identification of the letter's subject have allowed scholars to link it to the Bogomil movement. Let us look at how the letter's contents were interpreted. It became known to the academic community in 1913 through the publication of the Russian Slavist Nestor Mnemovich Petrovsky, who printed the original together with a Russian translation and a short commentary. At the time, numerous documents of Bogomil history were known, such as the said Sermon of Cosmas or the Synodicon of Zbíral. So it's not surprising that the new discovered text was linked by its publisher to this heresy. He correctly dated the monument to the period between 933 and 956. He assumed that the letter proved the existence of proto-Bogomilism, while Bogomilism itself could have been one of the branches of the heresy and originated after 956, and Petrovsky questioned the historicity of the figure of Bogomil. A historiographical canon of interpretation of the letter was established by Wasyl Zlatarski, who printed the translated text with commentary in the second part of his History of the Bulgarian State. He emphasized the involvement of the ruler himself in the fight against heresy. This will be a leitmotif of the hypothesis about the wide range of the heretical movement, although Zlatarski himself admitted that the letter was written before Bogomilism gained many adherents. Zlatarski corrected the quoted phrase Manichaeism mixed with Paulianism to Manichaeism mixed with Paulicianism, without signaling this to the readers. In a footnote, he points out that the name of the Bogomil heresy doesn't appear in the letter. He formulates 3 arguments which determine that the letter should be associated with Bogomilism, not Paulicianism. First, the heresy is called new, which fits Bogomilism, not Paulicianism. Second, it's a mixture of Manichaeism and Paulicianism. Third, in the dogmatic formulas, the main theses of Bogomil teaching are laid out. If we accept the correction of Paulianism to Paulicianism, it is of course difficult to think that the heresy to which the letter refers is Paulicianism at all. It would be utterly illogical to call Paulicianism a mixture of itself with something else. Zlatarski's 3 arguments raise key issue, accurately pointing to questions that determine the identification of the subject of the letter. It only remains to judge whether his arguments are correct. No better treatment of the problem of the identification of heretics has been proposed in the literature known to me. The most widely commented on was the last of the mentioned issues, the connection between the anathema and the Bogomil's confession. Soon after, in 1936, Zlatarski's opinion on this aspect was questioned by Venance Grumel, who pointed out that Teophilact's anathemas were written down on the basis of Peter of Sicily's History of the Paulicians. Henri Charles Touèche detailed Grumel's observations, showing more extensively the sources of the anathemas cited by Teophilact. We will return to Grumel's statement. For now, let us look at the position of Dmitry Obolensky, who remained faithful to Zlatarski's hypothesis. Obolensky accepts without hesitation that the letter concerns Bogomil. He regrets that we do not know the specific date of its composition, for with this we could determine more precisely the chronology of the development of Bogomilism. Obolensky already knows that the anathemas in the letter are unoriginal. He cites Teophilact's formulation that the heresy is a mixture of Manichaeism and Paulianism, not Paulicianism, so he ignores Zlatarski's conjecture. Of the three arguments of the doyen of Bulgarian historiography, he fully accepted only one, but Obolensky's conclusion remains the same. Obolensky attaches great importance to the term newly created heresy. He includes in his narrative a phrase of a letter not commented on in the works I have already discussed, in which Teophilact calls the heresy old and new. In Obolensky's interpretation, this shows that Teophilact clearly distinguishes between Bogomilism and Paulicianism. Bogomilism, the new heresy, from Paulicianism, the old heresy. As the argument continues, Obolensky draws attention to the fourth anathema of the letter, condemning those who regard marriage as a satanic invention and calling for the non-extension of the human race. He regards it as a non-Paulician novelty and a Manichaeist feature of the Bogomil Creed. After Zlatarsky, Obolensky claims that the letter of the Patriarch Teophilact testifies to the grave concern with which the Tsar Peter viewed the growth of heresy in Bulgaria. Obolensky's attempt to find in Teophilact's anathemas the characteristics of Bogomilism did not convince all scholars working on the subject. Ivan Dujchev in 1964 published another edition of the letter and included an extensive commentary. In his analysis of the theological content of the letter, he relied on the considerations of Henri Charles Puech. The French scholar came to the conclusion that the doctrinal construction presented by Teophilact was just an artificial creation, but he nevertheless accepted that the letter concerns Bogomilism and, as a historical document, has chronological significance. Dujchev insisted on a somewhat less radical formulation. He considered the doctrinal characteristic expressed in the anathemas to be faithful. Teophilact, after all, based his text on accurate data received from Peter in the previous letter. It was only the schematic form chosen by the Constantinopolitan hierarch that made these anathemas an obscure testimony of the past for a contemporary researcher. Teophilact, being a true Byzantine theologian, condemned the new creed using familiar patterns, heresiological cliché. Dujchev repeated after Obolensky that the letter is a testimony of Peter's deep concern for the state of affairs of the Church. He did not refrain on this occasion from stating that since Peter was so concerned about the new movement, it must have already reached considerable proportions. He quoted the phrase "a mixture of Manichaeism and Paulicianism" without any commentary. Dujchev's conclusions were quite faithfully repeated in his work by Dmitry Angelov. Alexander Soloviev, who listed above, in turn adopted Obolensky's position. Dragoilovich also treated the letter as referring to the Bogomils. He was led to an original reflection by thinking about the phrase "new heresy." His conclusion was that there was no Paulicians in Bulgaria in the period in question. It seems that none of the scholars seriously asked themselves what was the subject of Teophilact's letter. The boldness in formulating further hypotheses heralds that they take for granted the underlying hypothesis about the identification of the Bulgarian heretics from Teophilact's letter with the Bogomils. Bernard and Janet Hamilton's reflections from the introduction to their selection of sources for the history of dualist heresies bring a little more to the discussion of this topic. They do not directly pose the question of the subject of Teophilact's letter, but they undertake a fresh search for traces of original Bogomil beliefs in the anathemas. Their unquestionable contribution is the decisive rejection of the conjecture which has become firmly established in academic literature, ordering that the Paulians should be seen as Paulicians, in the previously mentioned phrase of the letter. Of course, according to the practice of Byzantine theologians, the Paulicians were hidden under the term Manichaeans, not Paulians. In addition to the fourth anathema, they also considered the second anathema to be non-Paulician. The latter idea on closer examination turns out not to be entirely accurate. However, similar positions were presented by Georgi Minchev and myself with regard to the issue at hand. To Professor Georgi Minchev we owe an exhaustive analysis of the term new heresy. He draws attention to the schematic nature of the phrase. Patriarch Photius calls the new heresy Paulicians, even though he knows its long history. The Bogomils, in turn, in the 12th century are considered newly appeared by Euthymius Zagabenos and Anna Komnena. The scholars who accepted the identification of the heretics in Teophilact's letter with the Bogomils were much more numerous, and I have cited some exemplary approaches to the subject, which show how the argumentation changed and, on the other hand, reveal a certain inertia in thinking. The linking of the letter with Bogomilism, which was made when the sources of the dogmatic passages of the letter were unknown, should be reviewed when those sources are discovered. I have listed here scholars who have taken different stances on the issue on the next slide. Disrupting the chronological order, I will first introduce the statements of Milan Loss. He focuses on the dogmatic content of the letter of Teophilact, concluding that the content does not allow a clear decision whether it concerns the Paulicians or the Bogomils. By regarding the Bogomils as a faction of the Paulicians formed in the Byzantine land, he invalidates the whole dilemma and avoids a clear declaration on the matter. Florin Curta is more decisive. He distances himself from the universally accepted truth without providing justifications or an alternative vision. You can see the quotation on the slide. Equally sparking in justifications are Nina Garsoya and Antonio Rigo, authors of the edition of the Greek sources for the history of Paulicianism, and Venance Grumel, none of whom should be faulted for this. Venance Grumel summarizes the letter, shows the approximate sources of the anathema. He correctly quotes the formula about heresy being a mixture of Manichaeism and Paulianism. He expresses his opinion on the identification of heretics in the given title. I quote it on the slide. The regesta he compiled was not the right place to get into petty discussion. Antonio Rigo is equally emphatic about the Paulician identification of Teophilact heretics. He states it in at least two places while speaking on other topics. On the one hand, it's a pity that they did not decide to convince the world of their opinion and present their line on thinking. On the other hand, their thinking may be very simple. An unbiased reading of the letter of Teophilact leaves no doubt as to its subject matter, its Paulicianism. This is evidenced by the dogmatic content of the letter and the names used in it, and there is nothing that contradicts this identification or puts it in question. Let us therefore return to Zlatarsky's argument. Teophilact calls heresy newly appeared, which does not fit the old Paulicianism but fits the new Bogomilism. I'm convinced that a literal understanding of this phrase is not appropriate. It seems to me that Georgi Minchev has shown this clearly enough in the article cited above. Even if we accepted the literal interpretation, we would be left with two possibilities. Either we are really talking about a heresy that did not exist before, in which case we would have to see Bogomils here, or about a heresy that has recently appeared in Bulgaria and within Peter's range of interest. Here both Bogomilism and Paulicianism fit. Second question, Manichaeism mixed with Paulianism. The Hamilton's explanation should suffice on this point, Paulianism being invoked only to justify the application of specific canons of law. However, if we reject this explanation, we must admit that naming Paulicianism in this way is unique. By contrast, it shouldn't embarrass us. Manes and Paul of Samosata occupied an important place in the history of Paulician movement, as it was known to Byzantines, which is confirmed, for example, by Peter of Sicily. The third point is the connection of the content of anathemas written by Teophilact with the Bogomil Creed. Among these anathemas, there are several that do not correspond in content to Bogomilism, as we know it from the Sermon of Cosmas. At the same time, they all find parallels in Byzantine texts pointing out the errors of the Paulicians or Manichaeans. The Hamiltons were wrong to point to the originality of the two anathemas. Sources of dogmatic content of the letter are discussed in the work Les Sources grecques pour l'histoire des Pauliciens. Tatarski argument proved to be wrong entirely. To sum up, if we accept the Paulician identification of heretics from the letter, then we are dealing with an interesting but not significantly problematic document of fairly predictable content. The important information the letter carries at the time is that the Bulgarian ruler was concerned about the presence of Paulicians in his state. The way in which the Patriarch advises to deal with heretics is also intriguing. However, if we were to adopt the Bogomil interpretation, then we must admit that the Patriarch's letter is very strange and puzzling. It does not contain the proper name of heresy it condemns, but it does contain others. It does not contain the names of its leaders, but it does contain the names of the leaders and legendary founders of the Paulicians. It does not mention its dogmatic content, but it condemns the dogmas of the Manichaeans and the Paulicians. I am in no dilemma as to which interpretation to choose, and I hope that my short work on the Bogomils, which is currently in print, indicated on one of the former slides, is the last in which this reigning thesis in Bogomil historiography has been defended so far. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jan. I'll be just the voice somewhere at the background. I will not switch my camera on so that we can see all of our speakers, but I will moderate the questions and answers. Thanks to you all for keeping time. This means that we have a very nice time for discussion, or more than half an hour. So please ask any panelist you like. Also, if you have problems connecting or if it's unpractical, I think that we can also allow a double system that you would ask your questions in the chat. So feel free to use the chat for asking questions, but always please do address the proper panelists, because not always it is clear who you are, who you might be asking. So that's my only comment before I launch the discussion. And I have remarked that there is already one question in the chat, which is directed to Professor Angelovska-Panova, and which concerns the relation between Hezekism and Palmism. So literally it reads, do you think that Hezekism and Palmism was the same thing? So Professor, if you could address this first question. The micro. We don't hear you. Could you switch on the micro?
Professor, should use the button under the video where we are. Red button, I think so.
Yes, it's bottom center. There are the icons. One of them is the micro icon. We still don't hear, actually, I'm afraid.
I will try to switch to meeting mode from webinar mode. I hope it's not going to collapse everything, but if it collapses, come back using links on our website. I think it would be much easier. And then now everyone can switch his camera and microphone on his own.
Okay, great.
May it work for Professor Angelovska-Panova now? Sure.
she's probably looking for some technical help. So I mean, let's continue. Let's hold this question, and yes, let's very interesting questions. Oh, is it perhaps it should be the panel a list of icons down at the bottom center. There was one moment when resizing the window helped, so that these icons appear. They disappeared to me as well, and resizing helped. Well, how about we leave Professor Panova time to fix the issue, and we will start with a different question. So please, if you have any questions to other panelists, go forward. By the way, you can raise your hand by clicking on the icon of the smiling face just at the side of the chat messages. So for now, if I see all the participants, I don't see any raised hands so far. But that gives me an opportunity to ask myself. But Jana, you're going to ask.
Thank you. I have commented short question to Andrew. Thank you very much for your paper. I really appreciate it. I really like the comparison of Cosmo's way of working, method of working. You have mentioned good ideas about link of the monasteries around the Bulgarian state, as far as I understood it properly, and defending border. Am I right? And if yes, where he wrote this, where he published this idea?
The Kurta reference, it's from his. Sorry, I'm looking for the article on. Now then, which is it? On Basarabi, Murfatla, that's on some modern day Bulgarian-Romanian border, and it's I can send you the reference. I mean, essentially, it's an interesting article. It seems it sort of suggests things, but he doesn't. I hope he's not here, or if he is, then we can ask him. But he points out this really. I don't think he develops the idea. Possibly, I mean, it's certainly interesting, and possibly he's developed it elsewhere. And I thought that it was an interesting possibility. But the sort of star of the show is this map, which correlates hill forts with monastic foundations. Or the sites of hermitages, which is very suggestive. I mean, it works very well. So I sort of, I went with that. But as I say, so far as I know, he hasn't developed that one further. But it's interesting.
It's the same case with my quotation, that he has very interesting idea and didn't. And I
found the reference: the cave and the dike, a rock monastery in the 10th century frontier of Bulgaria, and I can send you the full reference at some point. I mean, you can see where he's going with it in also the Southeastern Europe book. He talks about Silistra and the possibilities. That's a sort of little Pliska, as it were.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so now the problem with the marker is fixed. So Professor Angelovska-Panova, if you could answer this hot question on the relation between Hezekism and Palmism.
Sorry for the problem. I'm not very experienced with this platform, but I hope now everything is right. Yes, I saw the question. I think that both movements had the same source, Palmism as well as Hezekism, but the difference maybe is in the fact that Hezekism is more occultistic in sense of contemplation and mystic tendencies. On the contrary, Palmists are more familiar to rational tendencies in sense of some exegesis of philosophical aspects of the movement. You know, the dilemma is in interpretation of the light in Tiberian area. And if I can use the occasion, I also want to share some opinion with the participants. Thank you, David.
Sure.
I think I'm very deal with the Bojana statement about the oral transmission of heresies. And I'm sure that she has to continue in that direction, because especially in circumstances when we don't have an authentic literary Bogomil works, because of the character, of the nature of that kind of books, there more of them are destroyed. So I think that the oral transmission and the oral source will be important, especially if she managed to find some information, some data in the historical sources. And also, I have a question for Andrew, in sense, do you think, Andrew, what do you think if Clement, with his activity on as a teacher, with his students and his new methodological approach, which provide including of apocryphal texts, do you think that maybe he contributed in sense of appearing of Bogomilism later in that area?
Yeah, okay. I think what is striking about Cosmas's work is that he really sort of shows people are thinking things for themselves. And I think that you can obviously see some sort of, you know, if you're looking therefore for where do ideas come from. I was very influenced when I was writing this by Julia Smith's chapter in the, I think it's Cambridge Medieval History on lay society, and it's Western lay society in, you know, the before 900. But she really makes a very good case for showing, look, when you get these preachers going into the field and they get everybody enthusiastic, they really get people enthusiastic, and then people start developing their own ideas. And that becomes then a real problem for the church to sort of police. And I think that you can see some sort of same sort of correlation in Clement's work. He clearly is inspirational. I mean, I started looking at him and indeed the Theophilact's account of him, and we have to be sort of quite careful with just, there's a method here on how to convert you know, I got interested when I was doing the network theory material. And he really is working quite hard at getting sort of critical amounts of of well-connected people to spread it as in a network. I wonder, therefore, if the quality is still the same. I mean, it's all oral. He's he's talking to these. I think the point that Teophilact is making is, look, he's doing it on a bigger scale than Clement and than Constantine and Methodius, and I think that therefore that I would not be surprised if once you've been taught by Clement, you're looking for other ideas, and there may be other ideas around. Paulician ideas, whether it comes from the Christian Balaam Josaphat, those sorts of dualisms. I don't know, but I would put my money on Clement as a possible source of heresy as much as he is anything else.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a question by Jacek Wiewiorowski in the chat, which is directed at Jan Wolski, and it's on the key of truth, which was the basis of ideas of, for example, Nina Garsuran. Shall we reject now the influence of the document on Paulicianism and Bogomilism?
What concerns key of truth, I generally don't accept Nina Garsuran's thesis about adaptionist character of the first Paulicians, and then that they evolved into dualistic worldview. I think this document was later, and I think it's wider accepted. And if the second part of the question refers to the letter of Teophilact, I think it refers to Paulicianism, and it may be used to analyze the history of Paulicianism on the Balkan Peninsula. Yeah, I think if it's everything. If you have questions, it's just technical announcement. You can switch your camera and microphone instead of writing on chat. I think it would be more convenient for everyone. Now we are in meeting mode, so everyone can switch camera and microphone on its own.
Yes, absolutely. It's perhaps me who created them as by saying that there is this alternative of using chat also for putting questions, but it's definitely more convenient and personal to switch your camera on, so feel free to do that. This being said, though, we have two questions which have been posted in the chat, and both are directed at Professor Roach. So the first one is the opinion about the transcriptions of Murfatlar inscriptions offered by Professor Bob Konstantinov, and the other one is the reappraisal of heretical elements in 9th and 10th century material culture of the Bulgarian state, proposed by Dr. Georgiev.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to plead varying degrees of ignorance on those two questions. The Murfatlar inscriptions, they look fascinating, and I started to look at the literature on them. I did pick up the impression that at least some people thought they were later, and I have to say that I thought this is one controversy I don't want to get myself sort of too involved in. And the recent reappraisal of heretical elements in 9th, 10th century material culture by Pavel Georgiev. I'm afraid I haven't read Georgiev's work. I really will plead ignorance on that. But I would be grateful for any references that you wanted to send.
Excellent.
Can I ask this question personally? I have tried to use the chat first because I'm not a specialist in the area. The question was connected with my previous studies focusing on Paulicianism and Bogomilism when I was a student. It was more than 20 years ago. So that's why my question was connected with rejection or still discussing the question of key of truth, because this evolution, as said Nina Garsoyan, was rejected in the end of 90s, if I remember well. But I'm still curious about the modern attitude among scholars. Should we forget completely about this adoptionalism among Paulicians, and then this the evolution toward dualism, and the influence of this? I remember that the part of Paulicians were removed from Asia Minor to Bulgaria, and the story was in the Nina Garsoyan very, I don't want to say influential, but it was moving. The idea was really nice, but I'm still only interested in it. Should we forget about it completely, or shall we discuss it still? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wróblewski. I think that rather we should forget as far as arguments of other scholars. I find them convincing. In fact, I don't know who, apart from Nina Garsoyan, accept his thesis outside from Armenia. Key of Truth appears just a bit later document with no direct connection with real Paulicians.
But I remember the author from Armenia, Bartikyan, I remember well his name. He was also close to Garsoyan, and that's why I'm interested. Should we forget about it, or is it your personal attitude that you are against the ideas of Garsoyan?
Generally, I'm against her idea, but to tell the truth, I haven't studied it more in depth. I have been focused Bogomils primarily, so I'm sorry I cannot answer the question as it should be addressed. Maybe some other panel.
Thank you very much. There was only some interesting points in your presentation, because Nina Garsoyan was quoted, but her ideas weren't quoted. So that's why I was interested in this topic. Thank you very much.
Can I
say something about the key of truth? Well, in my opinion, this was the effect of the mix of the Paulicians with Paulians, so the followers of the adoptionist doctrine of Paul of Samosata. And it was the greatest mistake of Nina Garsoyan. And the very important issue is the age of this book, The Key of Truth. Well, according to the editor, Coniber, this book was written in the 9th century, but actually this theory, this claim was not confirmed by anything, only by the analysis of the language of this source. So generally, the book was found in the 19th century, as far as I remember, among the Tondrakians. So we are dealing here with two different heresies, and I think that there is no possibility of any connections between the Tondrakians or adoptionists and the Paulicians, because their doctrines differed seriously in the most crucial issues. Like, for example, in Christology, the Paulicians were Docetists, while the Tondrakians were adoptionists. They believed that Christ was only a human being, right? So it's totally opposite claims. That's why I think that we should not mix this to heresies. Thank you.
Thank you very much for clarification. It was only a question from my side to know, simply to know, because the discussion was hot in past decades. Now I'm not focusing on it, and that's why. Thank you for clarification. I think that you are right, especially when we remember about the late discovery of the Key of Truth and this edition from the end of 19th century or the beginning of 20th century. Thank you very much.
I have a question now for Bojana as well, so I was intrigued by this revival of interest in the overlaps between Orthodox monasticism and Bogomilism. You were dealing with it more in the sense of secretive infiltration, or this is at least how I got your point. So I would just like to ask you how this thesis of the closeness between some dissident monasticism and its passage, its very continuous passage towards Bogomilism, how does this thesis stand now, and how strongly do you want to argue that it's about infiltration of an existing religion of Bogomilism into Orthodox monastic circles, or is it somehow the other way around? So dissident monasticism getting Bogomil, and there being more of an overlap. Because really, what I understood from you was that they mingled mingled with monks. They infiltrated among monks. So, what's your view on that?
Yes, thank you, David, very much for your question. So, of course, this is a very big and complex research question. The connections between the Bogomils and Orthodox monks, and it can be observed from many ways. So, one of the ways to observe it is the social component. To say, because we have these accounts in the sources which say that the Bogomils looked like monks, they dressed like monks, they weren't different from monks. And for me, it's always interesting to look at both their exegesis and their social practice, and to try to compare those. On the other hand, we know that they also said they should use guile in order not to be recognized and in order not to be persecuted. So it was also what Eusebius Lekapenos said on the Bogomils, and I think it was one of the ways they acted. Yes, but then then there is another layer of this problem, is that the influences in the very dogma, in the teachings. There are Hezekist monks, and also Yuri Stoyanov has pointed to this connection which should be explored. And these philosophical and more spiritual strands among the Orthodox monks, I think that they could have found their way to the Bogomils, or vice versa. Sometimes we don't. I think sometimes it's not possible to say who influenced whom first. I mean, I don't know. I want to explore that as well. So I want to explore this social setting and to try to find as much as possible accounts on the Bogomils in the monasteries, because I think it was one of their modus operandi, one of the ways they used. But then, of course, there is also the need to explore this more spiritual doctrines like Hezekism, and I think it was connected to some of the Bogomil practices, which I will also develop later this year and next year. And another thing is this Bogomil rituals and prayers, which I'm also trying to work on when I have time. It comes from the early apostolic times, so it's not particularly Orthodox, but it's apostolic. It's also linked to the apostolic traditions of prayers, 5 days and 7 days. It comes from Hippolyte of Rome, and yes. So I don't know.
Thank you very much. I think that these religious cultures which operate undercover, they really sometimes need to adopt these practices, even if we need also to be critical to this discourse of secrecy, because it's a way how to say that they are illegitimate and that they are hiding what they really are. So there is a strong polemical discourse, and it's great to hear that you're trying to disentangle these different strands. So thank you very much for the answer. Other questions or reactions? I don't see any raised hands for the moment, but please just turn your camera and micro on and speak up. Oh, there is a there is a raised hand, but the real hand by Andrew. So Andrew, go forward.
A question to Jan, and I'm sorry that the sound quality wasn't brilliant when you were doing your paper, so you might have already sort of covered this. I was wondering, well, I mean, the mystery here is in Theophilact's the reply is, you know, what has Peter written? And I wondered, you know, okay, you've told us what it isn't, and you've told us why he's almost setting up the Tsar. I just wondered if you wanted to speculate what's in those letters.
No. I have written in abstract that we should treat this question, what was the subject of Teophilact letter, separately from the question what Peter asked him about. So maybe Peter was asking about Bogomils, and he had get answer about Paulicians. But it would, I don't like such a hypothesis. It has there's no ground for such hypothesis. I mean, why we should assume that there was such a big mistake in their correspondence? If we don't have any clues to think that there is such a big mistake, yeah, it would be big mistake. We shouldn't say so. I don't like this way of writing history.
At the same time, it is true that sometimes heretics are being assimilated to very improbable predecessors, and some genealogies are being constructed really in a very arbitrary way. So I think that there sometimes this idea that there is nothing really new may overpower the facticity. But it's an interesting thing to wait. Weight different factors. So the factor of experience and facticity, which is even in polemical literature, there is some concern for facticity, for persuasion, versus some rhetorical patterns that are there. So anyway, it's a big debate. East and West, Eastern heresy and Western heresy. This problem of continuity is a major one. And polemical rebranding of heresies. Thanks a lot. So we have the time for one last question, I think. So if there is anybody who still wants to ask some of the speakers, please do, or anybody from the speakers. Bojana.
Yes, it's just a comment. I wanted to say that I liked all the presentations, and to say that if we to find some similarities especially between those from Andrew and Maja, and which I found very important, to say maybe that this informal way of transmitting the Bogomil message was maybe had maybe the keys to their success, because if they went to the houses, to people's houses, it was more informal, it was more cozy a setting, and they didn't wait for people to come to church as the officials of, say, Christianity did, but they came to them, and maybe it explains something as well. And I look forward to reading all your papers. Yes, thank you all.
Thank you very much. I think that makes a very nice conclusion to this very fruitful session, and thank you very much for an inspiring discussion. So now we are very well in time. So we have 1 hour of pause. There is a break now, and we reconvene at 4. Again, there are 2 panels. One is running in this room, and the other in the Porphyry room. So have a look, and see you back at 4. Jan, is there anything from the organizational point of view that you would like to communicate to the audience?
Yes, thank you, David, very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. And so yes, so let's reconvene at 4 p.m. See you there.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.